the president of the American Communications Network. They spoke today at the National Conservative Student Conference in Washington, hosted by the Young America's Foundation.
Welcome back to Young America's Foundation's 19th Annual National Conservative Student Conference. We are pleased to have so many of you from campuses all across America here with us this week. Just a few of those campuses: Harvard, Columbia, Texas A&M, Penn State, Georgetown, the University of Virginia, Duke, and many, many more. This morning, Dr. Alan Kors, Michelle Easton, and Ron Robinson, Young America's Foundation's president, got us off to a lively and energetic start. And if you look at your agenda, you'll see this exciting pace will continue throughout the week. You'll be hearing from Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, House Speaker Newt Gingrich, Senator John Ashcroft, Nobel laureate James Buchanan, Oliver North, Walter Williams, Robert Novak, National Review's Cato Byrne, and we'll be treated to a private cookout at the home of Pat and Shelley Buchanan. It's a pleasure for us to be able to showcase these great conservatives, including the three gentlemen you'll hear from this afternoon: Dinesh D'Souza, Brian Becks, and Fred Barnes from the Weekly Standard. But it's a shame that we need to do this. It's a shame that we need to showcase these leaders. What I mean is, it's too bad that you won't be hearing the ideas you'll hear this week on your college campuses. So often, these conservative ideas are shut out of the college classroom and out of the mainstream media. The result of this liberal stronghold is an increased burden on the part of Young America's Foundation to host conferences such as this one and the ones that we hold around the country in Southern California, Hartford, Connecticut, Dallas, Texas, Richmond, Virginia, and this fall in St. Louis, Missouri. But the burden does not lie only with Young America's Foundation. The burden also rests with you. It's important that each of you get the conservative message out on your campus and beyond, because the conservative movement is relying on energetic students like yourselves to do just that. One of the primary functions of Young America's Foundation is to host speakers on college campuses. We've helped conservative students bring Jack Kemp, Margaret Thatcher, Clarence Thomas, and most all the speakers that you'll hear this week to campuses across America, giving the conservative agenda an opportunity to be heard. We believe that a one-sided education is not a true education, and that excluding the ideas that help to shape Western civilization does a tremendous disservice to today's student bodies. Our named lecture series in honor of William H. Flowers, William Casey, Grover Herman, and others help us provide ideological balance on campus. We are indebted to the speakers who are graciously sharing their time with America's youth, and to the supporters of this very critically important cause. Sadly, the liberal orthodoxy is not limited just to the college campuses. It's seeping at increasing rates into our high schools, our elementary schools, and yes, even our kindergarten classrooms. Just this past month, Young America's Foundation hosted its first National High School Leadership Conference to help these teenagers identify and combat liberal bias at even earlier ages, so that they'll be more prepared when they hit the university system that all of you are presently a part of. All of these efforts would be futile without our great spokesman, like the person you're about to hear from, Dinesh D'Souza. And in order to introduce Mr. D'Souza this afternoon, I would like to ask UVA student and Young America's Foundation's Sarah T. Herman intern, Paul Walkinshaw, to come to the podium to introduce our next speaker. Paul?
Thank you very much, Kristen. It is a distinct honor and privilege for me to introduce our first speaker this afternoon. Mr. D'Souza is no stranger to the leftist monopoly on college campuses. He, like myself and many of you, was fighting in the trenches not too long ago at Dartmouth College, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Dartmouth Review. He served as a domestic policy advisor in the Reagan administration during the 1980s. His New York Times bestseller, Illiberal Education, The Politics of Race and Sex on Campus, raised Mr. D'Souza to national prominence. His last book, The End of Racism, is a searing and powerful and ultimately an optimistic work. I can speak rather personally about The End of Racism because it has been the spark of several discussions, several classroom and casual discussions at my university. And I recently learned that Mr. D'Souza spoke at my old high school in Oakton, Virginia not too long ago, sparking such a controversy that the Washington NBC affiliate decided to run an expose of sorts on his speech. The headmaster declined an on-camera interview, but issued a statement saying if he had to do it all over again, he never would have invited Mr. D'Souza, for listening to him was like listening to Hitler. Now, you know when a conservative elicits such a ridiculous knee-jerk liberal response such as that, he must have something powerful and persuasive to say, and Mr. D'Souza does. He effectively tackles some of the most explosive issues facing our society today, and he, unlike other social critics, offers hope in his suggested solutions. To paraphrase James Madison, with Mr. D'Souza's help, we may finally behold a Republican remedy for our current ills. Mr. D'Souza is also currently working on a book about Ronald Reagan, which should be out this fall, and I'm sure when it hits the presses, we'll gobble that up. He and his wife, Dixie, are the proud parents of their two-year-old daughter, Danielle. Please join me in welcoming a longtime foundation friend and longtime conservative activist, Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a very wide podium. I guess I didn't have to wear pants. I'm delighted to be here. I love to speak at the summer conferences of the foundation. There's so much that I want to say. I feel a bit like the mosquito at the nudist colony. I'm not sure where to begin. But I also want to leave some time for questions, so I'll try to keep my remarks brief enough to do that. I'm reminded as I talk to you of my own college days and about the challenge that young people always face, which is the challenge of how to find a proper avenue for idealism. How to channel your enthusiasm, how to find issues that really move you and provide a focus for your thinking and a focus for your life. I don't have an answer for you. I'll talk a little bit in the beginning about my own college days, and then I want to talk more specifically about the politics of race and sex on campus, my topic for today. I remember when I think back of my days at Dartmouth, I remember myself as a little bit of a student guerrilla. We were an activist group of students running a renegade newspaper, the Dartmouth Review, which for almost 15 years now has been a bit of a thorn in the side of the college administration. I remember we used to tell the deans that taking on the Review is a bit like wrestling with a pig. Not only does it get everyone dirty, but the pig likes it. I must say that when one gets older, I'm now in my mid-30s and looks back to one's college days, you have a little bit of regrets because we were admittedly in those days a bit of a roguish bunch. We would do all kinds of guerrilla activities to dramatize what we saw as the absurdity of the policies of the college administration. I remember that a group of us sat around one day and we were trying to figure out a strategy for combating quite lavish funding that the college was giving year after year to the Gay Students Association. We weren't attacking the idea of homosexuality so much as the notion that this was something intrinsically worthy of college subsidies. Now, we could have sat around and made a long argument about why this kind of funding was undesirable and so on, but instead we decided to test the logical consistency of the college's policy of funding students based upon sexual orientation. What we did, in effect, was to found a Dartmouth bestiality society. And one of my fondest memories of college is sitting around before the deans with a very straight face, and really making the case for this, because the deans would say things like, well, surely there is no interest in bestiality at this college. And we would say, well, that may seem to be true, but that is because there have been centuries of discrimination and ostracism. Direct. Part of our iconoclasm was driven, I must confess, by our faculty advisor, Professor Jeffrey Hart. Admittedly, at a lot of college seminars, young people are told that it's nice to found a campus newspaper, but it's always helpful to have a faculty advisor because the faculty advisor can act as a moderating influence on the students. One of the interesting phenomena for us in connection with Professor Hart was that we had to be a moderating influence on him. And I think back to some of his own exploits, one of which was a column that he had written in the undergraduate daily newspaper. When I was a student, the big issue on campus was South Africa. And in fact, on our beautiful college green, you could hardly walk to class without seeing a large gaggle of protesters in the middle of the green, harassing students and yelling at them and so on. And Professor Hart noticed this group standing even in the middle of the winter out on the green. And he wrote a column in which he said that he was puzzled about what it was that brought this disparate group together to protest U.S. policies in South Africa. He said, South Africa is a very faraway country. Its everyday activities seem to have nothing to do with us. Why are these students so mobilized about this? And then he said, let me think about what unites these students. What do they have in common? And he says, the more I look at them, I realize the one thing that they have in common is that most of them are ugly. And he said, the more I think about it, what they are protesting is in fact not South Africa. It is that what they are really protesting is their own ugliness. They are in effect taking their own discontents, which are domestic, which are local, which have to do with their own lives, and projecting them onto this faraway country, South Africa. Well, you can imagine this column generated a good deal of argument, a good deal of controversy. In fact, kind of humorously, a few days later, the same protesters showed up on the green, but they were wearing suits. But I hate to add, but their suits were kind of ill-fitting and so on. They looked kind of out of place. Anyway, sophomores will be sophomoric. I think what attracted me in those days to the review most was that despite all this kind of playful theater that we engaged in as students, we felt that there were some very important and serious issues behind this playfulness. And that these issues had to do with important changes that were going on in the country and in the world. Changes that were reflecting themselves on the college campus. To give you an idea, if you were a student in the 70s, you had a group of faculty who had come to power in the colleges and the universities. And many of their ideas, many of their precepts came from the 60s. And they articulated a view of the world you would see in articles and journals and speeches and books that essentially said this. What they were saying is that capitalism is about to collapse. Its inner contradictions are being increasingly exposed. Socialism is probably going to be the way of the future. Guerrilla revolutions of a Marxist stripe are breaking out all over the world. And this was the prevailing ideology. I hesitate even to mention it because we are so remote from it now that it seems rather silly. And in fact, history has been very unkind to these assumptions. We live in a world in which communism has collapsed, Marxism has become discredited, in which what one can loosely call Western liberal capitalist democracy is now pretty much the norm around the world. But this provides an important clue to the whole debate about multiculturalism and about political correctness, because while this has been going on all over the world, on the campuses, which are deliberately somewhat insulated from society, I think you have a generation of young faculty who are now in power who have not assimilated themselves completely to these changes. In fact, there is a kind of discontent, a frustration with the direction in which the world has taken, really since Reagan became president in the 80s. And what you're seeing on the college campuses is a kind of reaction against these political developments. Now, I admit that if you're a professor at Oberlin or Swarthmore, there's not a lot you can do about the changes around the world. I mean, you can't put the Berlin Wall back up. You can't put the Sandinistas back into power. You probably can't even do much to affect what's going on in Washington. But you can take over the English department. So what these professors do is they feel that here on my own campus, where I have the reins of power, I am going to try to use my ideology as a kind of weapon to enlighten or re-educate the students. And so what we call political correctness, the term has become a little bit dated now, but what we call political correctness is really the effort to impose an ideology formed in the 60s that has been really not abandoned by experience, to impose this ideology on the new generation of students in the 90s. That is the heart of it. It is really more even a generational than even perhaps an ideological struggle, although it has ideological components. The important thing to realize about this ideology on the campus is that it is not primarily promoted ideologically or through argument or through lectures or through seminars. It is primarily promoted through manners. Now, what I mean by manners is this. I remember when I think back to my freshman year at Dartmouth. I was a young student, 17 years old, 18 years old. And I was fresh on a new, beautiful Ivy League campus. And the most important thing to me at that time was to figure out what did it mean to be an intelligent, educated Dartmouth man. That's what you want to find out. That's why you go to college. And then you go to a faculty cocktail party, for example, and you're discussing, let's say, the US policies in the 80s that had to do with Central America. And you say to the professors, "Professor, I am deeply troubled at the communist plot that is brewing in Nicaragua." What does the professor do? Does he attack you? Does he challenge you? No. He just kind of gives you a sideways look that sort of says, implies, well, Dinesh, are you from Iowa? In other words, the assumption is that you are somehow uncool. That this imputation of a communist plot is not wrong, it's rude. This is not the kind of thing you say in polite company. This is not the kind of thing you want to say if you want to be considered an enlightened Dartmouth man. And so you go back to your little freshman dorm and you go, oh, Dinesh, that was a bit of a gaffe. The next time you're at a faculty cocktail party, you wisen up. You say, well, Professor, I am deeply concerned about the rising tide of homophobia that is sweeping the country. And suddenly you realize you're cool. Suddenly you realize you have now spoken with the tide. You know, so my point is, ideology is most effectively transmitted, not by argument, but by this undergraduate notion of what it means to be in or out, cool or uncool, with it or not with it. And in a sense, the political pressure that conservatives feel is more the pressure of being, in a sense, stigmatized. Stigmatized as not being the in crowd on the campus. Now, let me look more specifically at some of the debates surrounding the politics of race and sex on campus. And I confess I'm going to talk a little bit more about the politics of race than the politics of gender. And the reason for that was stated some years ago by, of all people, Gerald Ford, who said there will never be a war between the sexes because there is simply too much fraternizing with the enemy. So gender is a real issue in society, but it doesn't have the same prospects for social balkanization, social division, as does the politics of race. One of the things that struck me as interesting about the debate surrounding race is that if you really look at it today, in its kind of multicultural context, by which I mean we don't just have whites and blacks in this country anymore, we have Hispanics, we have Asians, American Indians, many groups with many different ancestral histories and competing claims. What multiculturalism tries to do is to link these different groups, the non-white immigrants, the indigenous minorities, blacks, American Indians, and then add to those groups like women, gay rights groups, and so on, in a kind of common cause against the white male oppressor. Multiculturalism assumes that these other groups have something in common, which is that they are marginalized, they are outsiders, they are victims of discrimination. I think, however, that when you look more carefully at these other groups, forget about the white male oppressor for a moment, just look at these other groups. You can divide the racial groups into two categories: indigenous minorities, primarily African Americans, and non-white immigrants, immigrants from other countries. And what's interesting is that if you focus on these two groups, the immigrants and the indigenous minorities, you realize that they have two totally different perspectives on the American experience. One can loosely speak of an immigrant point of view, and loosely again speak of an indigenous or perhaps even an African American point of view. Now, the immigrant point of view is this. The immigrant point of view is America works. The immigrant point of view is that America offers horizons of opportunity and possibility that you can't possibly get anywhere else. The immigrant is using as the base of comparison his home country. So the immigrant says, well, listen, if I'm in India, they'll pay me $2 to work a day. If McDonald's is willing to pay me $5 or $7 to work an hour, that's pretty good. This is a great opportunity. Let me put in overtime. The immigrant's point of view then looks at America as full of possibility. And yet, we who are immigrants, I'm a first-generation immigrant. I came to this country when I was 16. The immigrants in this country are confronted by the leadership of indigenous minority groups, who in effect say to us, Dinesh, you're mistaken. America doesn't work. What you call the American dream is in fact a cruel hoax. Just stick around for a little while and you'll see that the hand of racism is going to keep you down. To which the immigrant replies, what hand of racism? We don't deny the existence of racism, but we deny its pervasiveness. Show me where racism is preventing me from getting into University of Michigan. Show me where it's preventing me from joining a law firm or getting a job or getting a loan. Show me where racism is keeping me down. And the answer is, if you can't see it, if racism isn't obvious, if it isn't apparent, that's only because it has gone underground. If racism is not overt, it must be covert. But nevertheless, even covert, this institutional racism, this racism invisibly built into the structures of our society, is keeping us down. And so this is really the heart of the American debate. It doesn't even involve whites. It's really a debate among minorities about whether or not the American dream can work for us. It is to this question that I'd like to now turn my attention for a moment. Let us look at the debates that are going on involving affirmative action at colleges around the country. One of the most important facts about this debate is that these debates, when you really look at them, they have absolutely nothing to do with racism. Look at the debate at the University of California at Berkeley, which has been the centerpiece of a lot of publicity and discussion. There is not a single affirmative action beneficiary at Berkeley, Hispanic or black or whatever, who has shown that there are bigots at Berkeley or in the admissions office or anywhere keeping him or her out. No one even alleges this. No one even claims that it is the case. Similarly, not one of the Asian or white students who are turned away from Berkeley with better grades or better test scores, not even one of them has been shown to be a discriminator. No one shows that they have inflicted any hardship on anyone at all. So in other words, affirmative action, even if at a theoretical level we need affirmative action to fight discrimination, it's not obvious that affirmative action policies as they are practiced have anything to do with discrimination at all. At least not in any direct sense. So now let's step back and ask, why have them? Why are campuses around the country so upset about Proposition 209? Why are they so upset about the colorblind idea? Why are they so threatened by it, and why are they complaining so bitterly that if affirmative action is not permitted, if colorblindness becomes the governing principle, that the result would be terrible? They are pointing to a real problem, but the problem I want to point out does not have much to do with racism. So what is the problem? Here's the problem as I see it. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement mobilized in opposition to what could be called the idea of nepotism. Nepotism is basically favoritism. Racism is one form of nepotism. It's basically favoritism on the basis of race. But there are other forms of favoritism. You can get favoritism because you're the boss's nephew. You can get favoritism because somebody just went to the same school as you did. But racism is one particular form of nepotism. Well, the civil rights movement basically said, we are against nepotism, and especially racial nepotism, and we are for merit. And so the original civil rights movement said, listen, we want to be treated equally on the basis of race. And we believe that if you do this, if you have laws that treat people equally, then we believe that all groups, in a sense, would begin to see themselves advance, and perhaps advance in comparable numbers. I think what has happened in the last 25 years is that this assumption has proven to be false. And what we are seeing, somewhat to our dismay, I admit it's not even an ideological problem, but it's an interesting social problem, is we are finding that merit produces much of the same inequality that racism used to produce. Think about that. Merit produces some of the same inequality that racism used to produce. Inequality not just between individuals. I mean, everybody knows that merit produces inequality between individuals. If you put 10 guys on a straight line and ask them to run 100 yards, they never hit the finishing tape at the same time. You have individual differences. We all accept that. But you might also have group differences. You might find, for example, that some groups always win the sprints, other groups always fall behind. So you might see in life, as in a race, that merit produces not just individual but group differences. And that is in fact what you are seeing. And now, since merit is producing much of the inequality that racism used to produce, a lot of activists and civil rights leaders have come to the conclusion, I believe, that merit is now the new form in which the old racism manifests itself. They've come to believe quite confidently that merit itself is a kind of racist concept, that it embodies racist assumptions. And this is a very dangerous notion because America, the ideal of America, and the ideal to which we who are immigrants are attracted, is the idea that in America you can start at the bottom, but if you have the ability and the effort, you're willing to work hard, you can have the opportunity, based on your merits as an individual, to advance. And so the attack on merit as an idea is an attack on the American ideal itself. It's not even an attack on American practice. Remember, the civil rights movement was an attack on American practices that fell short of American ideals. What Martin Luther King said is the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. Well, why don't the laws treat them equally? Practice was falling short of principle. I think what is a little bit worrisome about the debate now is it actually challenges the principle of merit itself. And that's why you'll hear a lot of people say things like, what is merit? Or so-called merit, with a kind of wink and a nod, as if we all know that merit isn't really a fair race. Now, the interesting thing about this debate is that we've had for a generation or so these so-called affirmative action policies, and I don't want to be too dogmatic about this. I think most Americans in the 60s were pretty supportive of these policies on the grounds that something needed to be done to break the back of the old segregation. Remember that affirmative action in this country was established initially for one group, blacks, to compensate and atone for and address a very specific series of historical crimes, slavery, segregation, and so on. No other group has been subjected to any comparable history. And so that was the original goal. One group, special preferences for a particular temporary, although unspecified period. But what happened is in the late 60s and early 70s, other groups essentially showed up. You'd have the Hispanic groups, the women's groups, the gay rights groups, and what they said is, hey, we are the new blacks. And we are victims of discrimination too. We demand to be given our space on the affirmative action bandwagon. And if you look at history, you'll see the black leaders in the 60s said, hey, forget it. You have no comparable claim. But then a kind of second thought prevailed in which some activists said, well, listen, look, as long as we blacks, who are 10% of the population, are asking for affirmative action, we are reliant upon the goodwill of whites. They are the majority, they have the power, it's up to them to give it or not. But if we let in the Hispanics, 8 to 10%, if we let in the women, 50%, if we let in all these groups and share affirmative action benefits with them, we have a majority. We are not reliant upon anybody's goodwill. We can vote to keep these preferences going on pretty much as long as we want, forever, if need be. So the decision to kind of admit these other groups into the bandwagon was really not a moral decision, but a political calculation. And one could argue that it strengthened the political base for affirmative action, although of course it's greatly weakened the moral case for it. It's greatly weakened the moral case for it because you've had such a promiscuous expansion of beneficiaries that today you can be an immigrant from Barbados or Bombay and you qualify for certain benefits that native-born Americans don't get. You can be the son or daughter of Jesse Jackson who went to private schools in the DC area. You get a preference to go to the University of Michigan over the son of a white postman. Now, no sane person can defend or has made any defense of these kinds of preferences. And so I think, to be honest, that the debate about affirmative action intellectually has pretty much ended. By ended, I mean that there are very few people even making a bold public defense of preferences. I found this when I wrote A Liberal Education. A lot of the administrators would really deny what they were doing. They wouldn't defend it. They wouldn't debate me on it. I remember the dean here at Georgetown Law School, Judith Areen. You know, a young fellow, Timothy McGuire, was working in the admissions office, and he noticed huge differences in the test scores of students admitted. And he wrote an article in the campus paper saying there's a lot of discrimination based on race going on at Georgetown Law School. And the dean said, oh no, we don't discriminate. And people said, well, really? So how do you explain this? And she said, well, see, we don't just take grades and test scores into account. We take into account other factors. So I wrote a letter and said, Dean Areen, I'd love to have a list of these other factors, because whatever these other factors are, it's pretty obvious that no whites or Asians possess them. Because whites and Asians never get into Georgetown Law School with those scores. So my point is, for a couple of years, the great disguise was a denial that preferences were even being implemented. One of the most interesting phenomena, people are saying, look, now that UCLA is because of the Regent's decision, applying a colorblind admissions policy, the number of Hispanics has really gone down a lot. Well, that is a problem, and it's worth discussing, but one of the interesting things that tells you is the degree of discrimination that was going on before. If a colorblind policy has caused the number of Hispanics to go down from 300 to 40, then it shows you that 260 Hispanics have, for the last several years, been admitted on a preferential basis. That's what the critics of affirmative action were saying all along. That's what the defenders of affirmative action were denying. They were saying, oh no, we're just picking between comparable or equally qualified applicants, and I think many of those myths about affirmative action have now, in a sense, been set aside. And the debate can now actually move on to a more sophisticated level, because I think Americans are by and large a people of goodwill, and the idea is not to deny that not everybody in life has the same breaks. I remember I spoke at Phillips Exeter a couple of years ago, and I remember very clearly a student who came up to me, a young black student, who said to me, you've been talking about affirmative action based upon disadvantage and so on. And he said, look, he says, I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action. I grew up in a poor family in the inner city, New York. I come from a single-parent family and so on. He says, I didn't have many opportunities in life. I am a success story of affirmative action. He says, I've gotten maybe they gave me a break to get to Exeter, but I've taken advantage of it. I've got good grades. I've got good test scores. I'm vice president of the student body. I've taken advantage of my opportunities. What's wrong with that? And I said to him, look, there's nothing wrong with that. You are indeed a success story of affirmative action, but let me ask you this. This year or next year, you're going to be applying to college. You want to go to Swarthmore, you want to go to Princeton, you want to go to Berkeley. Well, let me ask you this. Do you think you deserve another preference to get into those colleges? In other words, you are studying here at one of the best prep schools in the country. You have lots of other students who are studying at public schools, which cannot compare in terms of facilities and resources. You have taken advantage, you say, of the opportunities affirmative action gives you. So why would you now want another preference to get into college, and another one to get into graduate school, and another one to get a job, and another one to get a promotion, and another one to get a government contract? In other words, isn't there a point at which one has to say enough? That the time for the preference is to make a catch-up, and then that's it. One of the problems is defenders of these programs have never been willing to entertain any reasonable debate along these lines. I mean, one of the most interesting things about Proposition 209 in California is it has forced the city, it has forced the state, and to some degree even the country, to start thinking about alternatives and about better ways to make opportunity more widely available. One of the things that struck me as a student, and I saw this even before I was aware or familiar with the affirmative action policies, is the way in which these ideas play out beyond the admissions gate into the classroom and begin to affect the rhythm of life on campus and even what you study. I saw this in my own experience in this way. When I was a student at Dartmouth, I found I would go into certain classes, American history most notably, and I realized I don't know anything. Professors at a good school will walk into a classroom and say, okay, today we are going to talk about the Federalist Papers, Madison's discussion of faction, Publius's view of Book 10. Now, you can think of from my point of view, this was absolutely incredible. Who the hell was Publius? What were they talking about? In other words, without the proper background, without the proper training, I was completely at sea in this classroom. And here's my point. If you have an aggressive system of admissions preferences for any reason on a college campus, you in a sense create two student bodies. One student body that is in effect capable and able of keeping up the pace, and another student body that has the danger, the risk, the temptation of falling behind. And if you are a student who is not well prepared in a classroom, and a professor walks in and says, okay, I want you as a class to read Hamlet by Tuesday. If you think about it, a lot of our public schools are not training young people to read, let alone reading Hamlet, let alone by Tuesday. So what happens is if you are having problems reading Hamlet by Tuesday, it becomes very tempting to believe that the reason I'm having these problems is not because I'm not well enough prepared, but is because Shakespeare was a white male. In other words, it becomes very tempting to believe that the problems are due to a kind of Eurocentric curriculum, that the racism that in a sense applies to the admissions policy also continues into the rhythms of campus life. And I'm convinced that this drive against Western civilization, which if you think about it is a little bit silly in the sense that you can sit in a Paris cafe and within 5 minutes pick out all the Americans black and white in a moment. Americans are raised in a very homogeneous common culture in which assimilation, I mean, people say, well, is the melting pot still working? I mean, you only have to go to an airport, look at a 65-year-old Indian woman with a dot on her forehead and a sari, and she looks completely out of place in Western civilization, but you only have to look at her little 5-year-old to realize that that little tyke is completely at home in Western civilization. In other words, assimilation works very rapidly and quite unconsciously on people. And my point is this, that what you're seeing, the attack on Western civilization is not driven by a desire to escape from the ideas of the West or find some alternative ideology. It's interesting, a few years ago there was this massive search. The idea was, look, Western civilization is racist and sexist and homophobic. Well, let's look to non-Western cultures. Maybe we will find some better alternative to the bigotry of the West. And so our educated faculty friends begin to look abroad, look to Asia, look to Africa, Latin America. What do they find? They find that these non-Western cultures are pretty inhospitable to these very ideas. I mean, India has the caste system, women can't drive. And I remember when I was growing up in high school, we were taught a sort of proverb, a slogan that went like this. I asked the Burmese why, after centuries of following their men, the women are now walking in front. He pointed out that there are many unexploded landmines since the war. This is, I tell you this half as a joke, but only half as a joke, because it does convey a much broader sense of male superiority, of patriarchy, if you will, which very much is the universal norm. I remember that recently I read an article that the government of China has had a long-standing program of administering shock treatment to avowed homosexuals. And there is a government official in this article quoted as crediting this practice with, quote, a high cure rate. So non-Western cultures are pretty politically incorrect, if you will. And the important point is that the great works, the great books, the great ideas of non-Western cultures often reflect these ideas. The Quran, the great spiritually emancipating work for millions of Muslims, and yet it does have, I think we can't deny, some notion of male authority. The Tale of Genji, the great Japanese classic of the 11th century, celebrates hierarchy and ritual, life at the court, aristocratic virtues. The Indian classics, the Bhagavad Gita, Gitanjali by Tagore, these books celebrate transcendental virtues. They are a rejection of what you could call Western materialism, secularism, and perhaps even separation of church and state. My point is, what's happened is that the activists on our college campuses and the professors and the deans have suddenly realized that the great works of non-Western cultures reflect the ideology and even the prejudice of those cultures. And this is a real multicultural dilemma in our schools and universities, because what? The teachers can say, okay, we're going to teach you about non-Western cultures and we're going to denounce them for being even more racist and bigoted and retrograde than the West. This option, as you know, is politically impossible. Why? Because the non-Western cultures are thought to be victims. They are victims of colonialism, of imperialism, of racism. And the whole idea behind multiculturalism is to celebrate those cultures, to exalt them, to cherish them, to use them as inspirational role models to build the self-esteem of students on the campus. And so in reality, multiculturalism cannot apply a critical lens to non-Western cultures. And so that you have what can be called the double standard of multiculturalism, which is that while pretending to be interested in all cultures and pretending to apply a kind of uniform lens, a curiosity about all, they say, well, why have monoculturalism when you can have multiculturalism? Many is better than one. But in fact, you have a double standard in which Western civilization is essentially seen critically, and non-Western cultures are essentially seen uncritically, in which Western civilization is defined by a series of crimes, racism, sexism, and so on, even though all those crimes are in fact universal. Racism, slavery was a universal institution, patriarchy is hardly confined to the West, and so on. What's actually interesting and historically ironic, an argument I actually developed in the end of racism, is that the movements against these universal evils, the movement against slavery, the movement for the liberation of women, these emancipation movements are uniquely Western. And they're uniquely Western because they make unique claim to the Western notion of equality. A Western notion of equality originated essentially in Christianity. Christianity posits the notion that all men are created equal in the eyes of God. Originally, that view was thought to apply only to the next world. It was thought to apply only in a kind of spiritual equality. But what distinguished the early anti-slavery movements was that they said no, that this equality is not just a spiritual equality in the next world, it is a moral equality that should be respected politically, that no man has a right to be governed without his consent. And so you see the case against slavery and the case for democracy are the same. In both, there is the same principle, that no one has the right to govern us without our consent. And this is why the American founders understood from the very beginning the contradiction between the practice of slavery and the principle of the Declaration of Independence, that the Civil War was really nothing more than an acting out of that contradiction. Now, let me say a couple of other things. One of the questions I think we have in this debate is what can young people do? We live actually in a quite interesting and exciting world. We live in a world in which Western civilization, the world, the globe, is becoming more Western, and in which America is becoming more multiracial. So you have two seemingly diverse trends, or two trends moving in opposite directions. That after living in a century where it looked like Western power was on the retreat, if you look at great conservative thinkers like James Burnham, wrote a book in the middle of the century called The Suicide of the West. He says, hey, look, in 1890, the West controlled 90% of the real estate on the planet. He says, today we control about 40%. And at this rate, pretty soon we'll control nothing. He says, in a simple mathematical calculation, the power of the West is greatly declining. All that has been turned around. With the collapse of communism, you suddenly have the tremendous expansion of Western ideas, and I think in some ways the West is at the peak of its historical influence, and that Western influence today is transmitted not by force, but is transmitted voluntarily. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we control these countries because we have supervisory armies that have essentially occupied them. It's another thing to say that you have countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that essentially are writing letters to American companies saying, please relocate, please open branches here, that the only path to prosperity for our country is to have foreign investment. So you have Western civilization that is, in a sense, advanced dramatically. And it's advanced in a kind of, people who talk about cultural relativism, which culture is better, and so on, can never explain two things. They can never explain immigration. See, immigration is a refutation of cultural relativism. The immigrant is making a decision to leave one country and go to another. Why would he do that if he didn't think that one country was better than another? He is making, with his feet, a very important decision. The second phenomenon is that you have a universal movement away from agrarian tribal societies toward modern societies. That movement is unstoppable. People who start by wearing wooden shoes and now wear leather shoes never want to go back to wearing wooden shoes. I remember when I was growing up in India, that we'd have Western anthropologists come visit these Indian villages and study tribal peoples and so on. And the tribal guy comes out of his hut. He looks at the Western anthropologist with his glasses, his camera, his jeans, his tent, and so on. And the peasant says, hey, I want your camera. I want your jeans. And the professor of anthropology from Yale says, oh no, I'm not here to try to promote Western values. I am here to study you. In fact, I think that in many ways you are in a superior position to me. You are living in harmony with nature. And the tribal guy says, well, that's all very interesting, but can I still have your camera? So what you have is this universal aspiration toward modernity. And those of us who live in modernity know that there are problems with it. Problems of atomization and so on. But nevertheless, none of us really wants to go back. This is the logic of modern history. Now, on the campus, I think the best thing that you can do, I would suggest two things. The most important thing is to get a very good education. I mean, one of the things about conservatives is we tend to be far more enthusiastic about reading the great books than actually about, we tend to be far too enthusiastic about advocating the reading of the great books rather than reading them. I think it's important for us to plunge ourselves into the issues of the American founding. Why do we have in this country a representative and not a direct democracy? We could, by technology, on every major question, essentially have a random sample of Americans polled and do it that way. Why do we hire other guys like Clinton and ask them to decide for us? When you put it that way, you immediately see the great problems of the idea of representative democracy. And yet, the founders were... I remember that Clinton, in talking about race, which is now his sort of his bid for history, Clinton's been clair bout loose that history will judge each president by one line. Lincoln freed the slaves. Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. Margaret Thatcher. What can you say of Clinton? Think about it. Nothing. I mean, in a sense, he tried with the healthcare stuff, and had he done it, but he didn't do it. In a sense, I say that Clinton has become, in a sense, the custodian, against his will, of the Reagan Revolution. He has, in a sense, not been, and and so he's now trying this. The Clinton guys sit around apparently talking about how they can find a place in history. It's kind of comical. Reagan never did that. In fact, Reagan once said he never cared about what history would think of him. He said, all I want to do is I want to turn around the economy. I want to defeat the Soviet Union. I want to restore respect for traditional values. And if I can do that, I don't care what the historians think. Clinton's a real contrast with Reagan in many important ways. One of the things Clinton's been saying lately is, he wants to have a university system and a cabinet and a government that looks like America, right? Well, if you think about it, I have only one problem with that, and it's with one word in that statement. It's the word looks. Because what's going on here, and what Clinton is emphasizing, is a cosmetic diversity. Not a real diversity. Look at the Clinton cabinet, for God's sake. You have, 75%, I guess, are lawyers. Apparently, most of them belong to this jockey club here in Washington, D.C., and they essentially patronize this very exclusive eating club. Probably by the end of the second term, about a half of them will end up maybe indicted. I don't know. But I jest. But what I'm saying is this is a very homogeneous group. Very homogeneous socially, culturally, professionally, even ideologically. And so its claim to be representative of the great heterogeneity of America is clearly false. In fighting these trends, the most important thing is to be well-educated and to have a balanced sense of humor. Recognize that humor is a deadly weapon. Because remember, you're in a weak position on the campus. You don't grade yourself. You're in classes where you're at the mercy of others. And so what you want to do is not necessarily to be a kind of kamikaze, but rather to promote your ideas intelligently, often by asking the kind of wry question that exposes the contradiction in somebody else's argument. I think the tide is very much with us. Bob Dylan said, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. You only have to have been, I'm not very old now, but it's amazing to me how much in the short space of a decade or so, the political tide has shifted. No one could really have foreseen these developments. In fact, Reagan is one of the few people who did foresee many of them. But it's been a tremendous change. And I think we're coming back in the area of civil rights, and I'll conclude on this note. We're coming back to a very wise point that Martin Luther King once made. And it's not the line you're thinking of about the content of our character. But King actually said this. He said, look, what America is fundamentally about is the notion of giving us equality of rights. Equality of rights. And now I'm quoting King. He says, ultimately, every man will have to write with his own hand the charter of his Emancipation Proclamation. And what King was saying, and is very much in the tradition of Lincoln, what King was saying is that the government can give you equality of rights under the law. But that's it. That's it. What you do with those rights and what you make of your destiny, that ultimately is up to you. Thank you. We have some time for questions, so please feel free to go ahead.
Jim Polis from Duke University. It seems to me that since we might not be taught about Western civilization because of its imagined slew of problems, and we might not be taught about other civilizations because they contradict the very principles that they're supposed to be used to pass on to us, then we face the real prospect of being taught nothing. Faced with this bestial proposition, what exactly might we do about that?
question is, what constitutes, in a sense, a good education? I think one of the problems with the assumptions of this whole bridge to the 21st century, let's be ready for the future, is nobody knows what the future will bring. And so it becomes rather silly to prepare for a future that cannot really be anticipated. If you really look back, look at earlier predictions of the future. If you look, you read science fiction, look at H.G. Wells. What was his idea of what the future would be like? 400-pound robots, walking around doing everything. The future doesn't turn out like that at all. It turns out very differently. The reactionary who is anchored in the past, even though to some degree the reactionary wants to go back to perhaps a past that cannot be recovered, he has an intellectual advantage over the progressive, because he's actually anchored in something that really did exist, right? He is anchored in things that you can learn about, you can essentially study, and in a sense develop principles for life. Today the big thing is, we've got to all learn how to, use the internet and become familiar with the techniques of getting access to computers. Now, as a utilitarian point of view, I'm a writer, and I certainly want to learn how to use computers to make my writing more effective. But the fact is that technology over time is going to become easier to use. You might even be able to access the computer by just talking to it. And so what's most important is not learning how to use the internet, but learning what to say when you actually set up a program and want to write in it. And the problem is that we are emphasizing technique over content. And that's going to be, I think, a real problem. With Western civilization, I remember Mahatma Gandhi, my countryman, used to say, was once asked by someone who said, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a good idea. The debate is not really about Western civilization per se. It is true that there are certain powerful Western ideas. The two most powerful Western ideas are the idea of liberty and the idea of equality. Both of them are problematic ideas because the idea of liberty gives you freedom. Freedom can be used well. Freedom can be used badly. One of the interesting debates within conservatism now is you have a debate between Reagan's optimistic view of freedom, which was Reagan's view was give people freedom, let them keep their money, they will forge a decent life, a good American dream for themselves. Reagan was very optimistic that people would use freedom well. If you read Judge Bork, Gertrude Himmelfarb, a lot of conservative thinkers today, they are very pessimistic. They fear that freedom will be abused, that if you have freedom on the internet, people will set up porn stations and so on. And that creates a very different politics if you have a pessimistic outlook about people. So that's one of the interesting debates going on now about, well, freedom is ambivalent. Equality. There are two kinds of equality. Equality of rights and equality of result. Which kind of equality are we for? What kind of equality does the Declaration of Independence specify? A scholar, Mel Bradford, at the University of Dallas, wrote an attack on Jefferson and on Lincoln some years ago, in which he said, look, these guys are citing the Declaration of Independence, and they're saying all men are created equal, and that's supposed to be a self-evident truth. And Professor Bradford said it's a self-evident falsehood. He says, look around. People are different in height and weight and looks and in beauty and speed and intelligence and in performance and aptitude and in moral character maybe. In every respect, it is inequality and not equality that is the self-evident truth. Now, at this point, Jefferson was aware of this. And in fact, Jefferson, in a very important passage, he talks about this concept of the natural aristocracy. And I say that because it's actually very interesting. Jefferson strongly attacked the European aristocracy. But he attacked the European aristocracy not because it was aristocratic, but because its aristocracy, in his view, was based upon the accident of birth. What Jefferson said is we do need an aristocracy, but it should be based on merit. We want to have people advance based upon achievement, not based upon who their grandfather was or whether they were born in a big house. So you have an interesting tension in the Declaration and in the American tradition over these two ideas. And then the question is, are liberty and equality compatible? The founders thought there was a way to make them compatible. See, I think these are the questions you want to explore as a student. Once you get a job, it's going to be hard to find time unless you, like me, become a full-time student in a sense. It's difficult to think about these sorts of questions. So you want to devote as much as you can to doing that, and if you don't do it in the classroom, you should do it on your own.
I'm Michael Long from the University of Pittsburgh. I think it says a lot when a conservative's quoting Bob Dylan. You can tell how far society's come along. But I was going to ask the question, do you foresee in the near future a changing of the guard in academia or in the general consensus on campus or even in society in terms of affirmative action and race-based programs? Do you think there is any tendency to move towards eliminating these, particularly maybe by the election in the year 2000, that may be an issue that the Republicans can use? Do you think that that will carry any weight in society in general, or do you still believe there are a lot of people that are proponents of affirmative action and will facilitate its current existence?
Let me go from quoting Bob Dylan to quoting Jesse Jackson, who said a very wise thing, I'm sure accidentally, but he said, and you can really see that this is a kind of quintessential Jacksonian statement. He says, capitalism without capital is only an ism. If you think about this, there is a kind of truth to it. What Jackson is saying is that capitalism requires capital. It requires money. It requires something that you can put at risk. And that if you don't have it, it's just an ideology. It's just an ism in that sense. It's just a theory. Now, I think what this points to is that the real need in our society is not for preferentialism. It is for having access to the means of capital that allows one to enter the market and take risk. Unfortunately, if you look around, look at the worst in neighborhoods and in our inner cities, the only risk takers are the drug dealers. You have a kind of debased capitalism at work. What we want to encourage, I think, is productive capitalism in which you can help yourself and help your neighbor at the same time. I think what's happened in affirmative action is that you have essentially have a rift between the larger American community and African Americans. African Americans, you do have critics of affirmative action, but I think blacks rightly feel that historically affirmative action has helped to deliver the goods. You have a black middle class, and affirmative action wasn't the only factor, but it helped to create that or accelerate it. And I think there's a nervousness that if that's taken away, that something tangible is going to be lost. On the other hand, I think that most non-blacks, and this is mainly whites, but other groups as well, basically feel that affirmative action doesn't really have a moral justification and that the time has come to at least seriously reconsider and perhaps eliminate it. So that's the political situation, and what it means is, but there is a social situation that is underestimated, and that's this. We are now in a social universe in which even conservatives are making subconscious head counts based on race. One of the things Newt Gingrich said a couple months ago is that one of the reasons he was reluctant to push forward on a law that would mandate colorblindness is because the black Republicans were not enthusiastic about it. It's very interesting, because he too realized tactically that, hey, we've got to make sure that our blacks, in a sense, are on board. Even our side counts by race. So, in a sense, I think this counting by race, which is itself the problem, has unfortunately become a quite pervasive sentiment. We used to have a young black guy who worked for the Review, a very smart guy, and a good editor of the paper. But he always had the first crack at the summer job with conservative organizations because he was black. And he knew it, and we knew it, and we were slightly peeved by it, but nevertheless, my point is that race counting has become pervasive, and it's an unhealthy thing. But socially, what I mean is that I think that there is a kind of embarrassment to have colorblind laws that produce racially concentrated outcomes. And so, for example, one of the strongest points the defenders of affirmative action have now is they're going around saying, well, what if you have a colorblind university like MIT? And what if it requires that people just get in on the basis of math scores? And what if 60% of the students who get in are Asian and 40% are white, and there's only one black student in the entire MIT campus? Are you willing to live with that? You know, and there's a pause, because there seems so Interestingly, the main opponent of affirmative action, the main force keeping affirmative action intact today, is not a belief that this is a racist society, is not a belief that race should count, but it is a discomfort with the outcome. It's a discomfort with the outcome, particularly when the outcome is, as I say, very racially lopsided. And that's what we need to think about now.
Tennessee University of Virginia. Something you alluded to in your speech but didn't actually get to is that this merit discrepancy among races. What solutions have you looked at to maybe bridge that gap in terms of education or whatever, solutions that are more affirmative than affirmative action and do not use discrimination in that sense?
The problem, as I would describe it, is this. If you take a randomly selected group of 100 whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians in the country today, at any age, in any part of the country, and you give them an academic test, any test, make it a math test if you want to, make it a reading test if you want to, doesn't matter what the test is, any test. And you give it to a randomly selected group of students, I will tell you in advance what the result will be. Asians and whites will do the best, Hispanics will fall in the middle, African Americans will do the least well. Now, I discuss this tragic, in my view, pattern in my book with a lot of data, and I've been debating this subject now for, I guess, a couple of years. I assure you, there is not one person in the United States who has been able to tell me a test in which this result will not occur. What it shows is that merit is really a discriminator in a sense. Merit is producing this inequality, and the debate is over why. There's really no debate about the fact. The debate is over why this is occurring. Now, there are three views in this debate. The liberal view, of course, is that the reason merit is producing inequality is because of societal discrimination. That society artificially creates this inequality. That's the liberal view. Then you have the Charles Murray view, as argued in the bell curve, which is that there is maybe some natural reason, genetic, biological reason perhaps, that causes this inequality. My view is a third view, which I think has until now not really been part of the debate, which is the cultural view. And the cultural view is that groups, like individuals, differ for cultural reasons. And by cultural reasons, I don't mean something inherent or unalterable. Culture is nothing but a common term for habits, for learned practices that can be changed. And that's why I think ultimately my view is optimistic, because quite frankly, if you think racism is due to societal discrimination, I don't know of new ways to fight racism that are going to improve young people's test scores. No, in fact, no one does. Similarly, if these problems are genetic, quite frankly, what can you do about them? You can't change your genes. In fact, if they are genetic, one might say that that's a good case for affirmative action, because if you have large genetic differences between social groups, you may not want to live in a racial caste society where some groups are always at the top, other people always at the bottom. You could argue that there are some cases for helping those who can't help themselves, who are at the bottom genetically. So oddly enough, I think the bell curve unintentionally makes a case for affirmative action, because it implies that there is something unalterable about these conditions. So the cultural view is optimistic in that culture has to do with habits. Habits can change. Habits change all the time. Look, when I was growing up in India, India had inherited a socialist culture from the Indian leaders who were educated in England and so on in the 30s. And they got from the Fabian socialists a way to run a society, which proved to be terrible. But once the Indians saw the South Koreans and the Chinese and so on were doing much better with capitalist economics, the Indians have kind of figured out there's a much better way to do things. And so Indian society, I can see within my own short lifetime, changing dramatically. New habits are being cultivated, new ways of doing things, simply based upon a pragmatic consideration of what works. So similarly, I think one of the nice things about multiculturalism is that groups can learn from each other. Asians might be very good at math, but might be weak in other areas. And the point is, even in the inner city, if you want to say, how do you get out of the inner city? Well, let's look at groups that do get out. What do they do? And so you can learn, I mean, apart from the idea of government solutions, vouchers, enterprise zones, and so on, and there are some government solutions, but the real advancement, I think, is going to come outside of those, more in the private sphere. Now, I think the one area where the government's very important is the public school monopoly. And I think the only way to break that up is through giving real incentives to parents. So I think there will be some real change in that area. It's going to be a very big issue. But apart from that, I think, for example, one of the lessons I learned about American life in the short time I've been here is that if you want to get rich, if you want to move up, if you want to get ahead, entrepreneurship is a much faster way to do that than almost any other way. If you look at, there's a book out called The Millionaire Next Door, which looks at people who have made money. Many of them are very frugal, and most of them are self-employed. Most of them own their own businesses. That's a much faster way to move up economically than a salaried job. I think what happened with the civil rights movement is it was a Faustian bargain. It is said to a lot of young blacks, listen, you can get a job in the government, you can get a job in the affirmative action sectors of companies, but the downside of that is that government is a stagnant institution. Public confidence in the government is now subsided. People are talking about downsizing the government. That'll hurt the black middle class. When I was in the Reagan administration, it was a great opportunity for me, but I realized after being there for 2 years that I was learning skills that were unique to government. There were other guys who were in the administration who had been there 8 years, who were in their 50s, making $77,000 a year, applying for jobs in the private sector, and they couldn't be hired for 50. And they were shocked and disturbed. And they said, we're very troubled. We can't, get good jobs in the private sector. And I'd say, well, what is it that you do? They'd say, well, we write memos, And that was their skill. They wrote memos, So the problem with government is that it doesn't necessarily teach you a lot of skills that are useful in the private sector. And that's why I think one of the smartest things I did was I went into government for a couple of years and then was convinced by Chris Demuth, the head of AEI, to get out and develop a private sphere of knowledge that could then be used later. Just one more question. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jay Keller from Penn State University. Oftentimes when speaking against racial preferences, say on campus, it never fails to get either thought of or called a racist. I guess my question is, what kind of things should conservatives do now to convey the real feelings we have about racial preferences? Not that we're a racist, but that we think diversity is what contributes to America's greatness. What kind of things can we do to show that to people of minorities?
You're asking actually a very tough question, which actually makes me wish I had concluded before your question, but which is just how to cope with the accusation of being a racist. And when I wrote Illiberal Education, I had a funny. I have clearly a certain degree of ethnic community on the subject of race. I've had a couple of interesting debates with these multiculturalists about whether a person of color can be a racist. But I remember speaking when I did a few debates connected with Prop 209 in California, and at one of them there was an American Indian activist showed up, his body riddled with buttons and so on. And this guy was employing, in fact, it was referred to in the introduction a little bit, this what I call the reductio ad Hitlerum. Every time I would say something, no matter how innocuous, he would say, "That's exactly what Hitler thought," And so, in fact, some of what I was saying was similar to what I've said here today. And sure enough, he'd show, "That sounds like Hitler. There goes Hitler," And so finally, I just said, "Listen, you keep this up, and you'll give Hitler a good name, The serious point is this: that one of the problems with the promiscuous overuse of the term of racism is the term begins to lose its meaning and begins to rebound. In fact, the term racism carries far less bite now than it did 10 years ago. For this very reason, you saw some, conservatives to some degree may have made this mistake, and I wasn't there, but from my reading, the debate about McCarthyism, where essentially if a communist is not just a Soviet agent or somebody who belongs to the Communist Party, but somebody who once went to a communist meeting or someone who was once seen with a communist, if that is the case, then what happens is the charge over time begins to erode and finally boomerang. Remember, the charge of communism was essentially trumped by the charge of McCarthyism. So you could go around saying, you know, communist. The other guy would go, McCarthyite, you know, and boom, you know, you were knocked out. So that's what's been happening to racism. Is its currency has been devalued. I think it is a term that you know we should continue to take seriously and not trivialize. Let the other side trivialize it if they want to, but we should be careful about what it means. You know, racism is a doctrine of innate superiority. It's a doctrine that some people are innately better than others due to their race. It is not somebody who is, you know, critical of current levels of immigration. And so I think by being precise with the use of the word, we're showing our respect for it. And we're not allowing. So I think that kind of moral seriousness becomes a useful weapon. You don't want to get into the I am not a racist game because you can't win. That's the kind. The charge of racism is a crime of motive. Remember, racism is a mental offense. Discrimination is conduct. Discrimination is action. So discrimination we can talk about. Were you really discriminating or not? In my book, I discuss, you know, this troubling matter of rational discrimination. Are there cases where it's rational to discriminate? Putting that aside for the moment, the charge of racism is a charge of having bad motives, and therefore professions of sincerity often don't buy you very much. That's why some of my best friends are black, or has never been an effective and has been a self-defeating form of apology. I don't know if I've clarified the issue or figured out a strategy, but I think the way to deal with it is to be careful in the use of the term. Confident, however, that you know, if you're convinced your beliefs are sincere, that you're essentially defending the idea of equality, you should not be scared off. You should be firm in your convictions, and you will carry the day. Thank you very much.
Mr. D'Souza. He did refer several times to his book. We do have that for sale in the back of the room. If you're interested in getting copies of The End of Racism, it is available. And now we'll take just a really quick stretch break. We're running a little bit behind schedule. So if you want to stand up and stretch your legs, and then we'll get started with the next speaker. Thanks.